Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. This is episode 246, and in this episode, I'll be talking to astrologer Darby Costello about the astrology of the four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Hey, Darby, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chris. It's nice to be here. It's nice to see you.
Yeah, I'm excited to do this episode with you. I've been wanting to do an episode on the four elements for quite a while now, and last year I discovered that your books on the subject, or your book on the subject, which was initially a series of lectures that you did in the mid-90s
Yeah,
on the four elements, was recently republished just last year in 2019, right?
yeah, it was. Tony Howard did it. He republished them beautifully, I think. I love what he's done with them.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
love the new covers. So
Aren't they lovely? Yeah.
volume one is titled Water and
Water and
Fire, the
fire.
Astrological Elements, Book 1. And then the other one is Earth and Air, the Astrological Elements, Book 2,
Yeah.
by Raven Dreams Publications. So this is originally, though, a publication that you did in the mid-1990s for the Center for Psychological Astrology Press, right?
And that's what they looked like then, hardbound.
Brilliant.
Aren't they
Okay.
with gold letters? Yeah, Liz's publishing house. Yeah.
And you had an interesting story behind that, because she kind of encouraged you to publish those books?
Yeah, because I'd tried. I'd been living in Africa, and I came here, and everybody had published books, and I couldn't write. I just couldn't. I tried and tried and tried, and she said, "I'm starting a publishing company, and I'd like you to write a book for me." And I said, "Oh, I can't. I can't. I don't know how." And she just said, "Oh, do it for me." And I really liked her, so I said, "Okay." That was it. It allowed me to step out of myself. And then I said, "Oh, what am I going to do it on? I don't know." And the first one, she said, "Well, you're always talking about the progressed moon. Do it on that." And so that was the first one that I did. And then I got into it, and I really enjoyed the fashioning of sentences slowly. And there were transcripts originally. But again, I said to her, "But I just babble and talk and talk and talk. As you can tell, I don't have punctuation." And she said, "Well, take the transcript and then reshape it." And so in a way, it's a conversation between me and somebody I call audience.
Mm.
And sometimes it is the audience, but sometimes it's just a conversation that almost I'm having with myself in some way, a dialogue, between myself and someone else. And so in the end, they were very satisfying to do. And of course, I love the elements and always have. I've always been in love with them right
Yeah.
since the beginning.
And that's something I love about the Center for Psychological, those old publications, is that they're sort of transcripts or dialogues, which
Yes.
makes me think of reading some of these old, like ancient Greek texts, like Plato or something, which
Yeah.
are written in the form of dialogues.
Yeah.
So just to introduce you to my audience, for anybody that's not familiar with your work, what's your background in astrology, or when did you start? How did you get into it?
I did a degree at a Catholic university in America in philosophy, psychology, and theology. And I was going to go on to do a master's and onwards, as one did, kind of thing. But I went to California, and it was the 60s. And I sat around with some people, as we did in the 60s, and somebody started talking about astrology. And I sat with some guy, I don't remember, and we sat there for 9 hours trying to figure out how to draw up a chart. We just sat at that table, and at the end, we figured it out. And at some point, I went back to Massachusetts because I said, "This is really interesting." They were talking about it, really interesting. And he said, "But in Massachusetts, you'll find the best teachers. So go back there." And so I did. I went back, and I think I went back in 1968, and in 69 I started. And I didn't realize that I was going to do that. I still thought maybe I could just have it as a little hobby. But I read Dane Rudhyar's Pulse of Life. It was called, I think he renamed it or something. And I sat in a field, I think it was in New Hampshire. I sat in a field and I read the book. And I went back into the group of people I was staying with, weeping, because I knew I couldn't go on in ordinary, conventional world. I had to study astrology. And then I found Isabel Hickey and Francis Sarkoyan and Louis Acker and got obsessed. Meantime, making money by working in the psychiatry department at MIT. So it was a kind of interesting mix. And I became completely obsessed and completely in love in 69 and 70.
So you're from Boston originally, and yeah,
Near
1960
Boston.
near
Yeah,
Boston, and
yeah,
1968, 1969 is when astrology has just exploded, and there's a ton of
yeah,
people from your generation that were people born in like the
absolutely.
1940s that are all getting into it at around
Yeah,
that same time.
absolutely. Yeah,
And you find yourself actually in a sort of hotspot for astrology at the time because you
yeah.
mentioned Isabel Hickey, and she was one of the major astrologers, or it seems like a number of major astrologers ended up studying under her or being sort of coming into contact with her at different points in some way.
Yeah, she was. I went back to Boston and I knew a couple of people, and I said, I need a job, a bicycle, and a roommate who's interested in astrology because I'm here to study astrology. And my
Uh,
friend said, oh, I work at MIT and I'm leaving to go off to California, so take my job if the head psychiatrist like you, and you can have my bicycle. And then she introduced me to a young astrologer, and 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 somebody got me an appointment with Isabel Hickey. I remember it was
mm,
$10. It cost $10, and she looked at my chart and said, "You should be an astrologer." And I thought, oh, because other people in California had said that, and I thought, is that what they all say? Good heavens, what is this about? And she said, but I can't. But she was respectable. And she
mhm,
said, but I'm not teaching in the summer, so go to Francis Sarkoyan and Louis Acker in the summer, and then come to me in September. And what I didn't know is they weren't friends,
mm,
but what she was doing was keeping me there. And so I went to Francis and Louis, and then I started with her in September and had them all for a period of time. And they were what you would do is you'd come into the basement or wherever it was, I think hers was, and you'd sit down and you'd say prayers. And one of the things I remember is she said, you you were all in Atlantis and you didn't pay attention. Now, when you learn astrology now, you pay attention. You're very responsible. You pay attention and you don't let that happen again. And whether she was speaking metaphorically or literally, I don't know. But I remember thinking, having a sense of responsibility that was so powerful about how we would use this and how we were there to guide people in a particular way. I was young, and
sure.
but it was very powerful. They gave us a sense of our own connection to something very that we had great responsibility and had to be very, very responsible to the people whose charts we looked at.
Sure. So that's a specific stream of like modern astrology of like the Isabel Hickey school, the Francis Sequoian and Louis Acker, who also wrote
Yeah,
very popular books on astrology around that
later.
time.
Yeah, a bit
But
later.
then
Yeah,
you're also getting into Jung or getting into Rudyard, and through Rudyard, of course, there's a lot of influence from Jung, and
yeah.
then you gravitate or move more towards psychological astrology, right?
Well, I didn't know what I was doing really. I mean, I had a psychological background in one way, but I
Mm,
went to Africa after I finished, after I'd been studying for a year and a half. I went to Africa and and stayed there for 12 years and was living with tribal healers for most of that time and working with them, recording and transcribing their stuff. And one of the first people I met was a Jungian, a person passionate about Jung. She ended up going and becoming a Jungian analyst in Zurich. But at the time, she was just loved Jung. And so we read Jung together the whole time. And I don't know that I'd really gotten into him until I met her. And then I really got into it. And I didn't know, I was just doing charts. And I was using a lot of reincarnational ideas because Isabel had that very, very strongly. But
mm,
over time, because I was doing charts for people, anyone, who asked me, over time, I stopped using the reincarnational imagery and I started using psychological imagery more, but almost of my own kind, not a specific, this kind of psychology, just from all of the things I'd read, and
mm.
was reading. Yeah. And
Okay.
then I read Liz books arrived down there. And I started reading those and I started thinking, this person is really interesting. And ended up, when I came up here, ending up, being part of the CPA once it got going. So that was lovely.
So once you moved to the UK or moved to London, you eventually got integrated into the Center for Psychological Astrology.
Once it started, Howard and I in Boston were very close. I think he and my sister were roommates or something. We were all hanging out together. And
Howard Sasportas.
Howard Sasportas. And so while we were studying, Natalie, my roommate, and I, he came over and hung around, and we just had long conversations, a lot of conversations. And when I left and went to Africa, he said, he wrote it in a book, so I'm not saying anything he would mind, but he said, those conversations have been really interesting. I'm going to England and I'm going to study astrology. And he came over and really studied it with the faculty and everything. And then he and Liz became friends. And so I think it might be through him that I met her when I came over once, and we sat and talked for hours and hours. And when I eventually came over for good in 71, then, in 83, I went to Africa in 71. In 83, after a while, I contacted her again and we started talking again. And then when they started the school together, they invited me to join.
That's interesting, because didn't she study briefly under Isabel Hickey as well? So you could have crossed paths, but just didn't back in Boston?
She did a year. I think she was there a year earlier than me, or
Okay.
a year or two earlier. And then she went to California, but I never saw her in California. I never met her there. So we were all hanging around in the same streams, but some of us met and others didn't,
Right.
And I remember reading her books and thinking, this person has hit something. And it was like reading, for me, when I read Dane Rudhyar, I wept with the beauty of it. And when I read her, I had chills with how she was talking. It was like, this conversation, this language, I understand so well. She speaks it so beautifully. So, but you develop, in those days, we each developed our own version of things, and we didn't have something we were downloading we were just reading everything we could and experimenting and playing with everyone. And every time I still do, every single time I watch someone on TV, I look up their charts. If I read about someone in the paper, I look up their charts. If I meet someone, I have a conversation with them, I get their date of birth. It's just an automatic thing that started then, it carries on.
So eventually in the 90s, you decide to focus on the elements at some point, and you present, it started out as like a series of lectures or something on the elements, right?
That's right. Yeah. Liz would say or Howard, either one of them would say, Juliet was the administrator, Juliet Sharman Burke, and she was the administrator. And then she would say, okay, what are you going to do? What do you want to do? And each semester, we'd decide what we wanted to do. And I don't know, after the moon, I think, again, it was like, I just love the elements. They fascinated me. And so I thought, when she said, do you want to write another book? I thought, yeah. And I put water and fire together because for some reason, water and fire they're so not alike, but they're alike in a particular way, an imaginal way to me. And earth and air seem more of the same. I don't know quite how to say it. They seem to me right together. Like water is, water and fire have images, and they come from feeling and passion. And so I had to put water and fire together. And it was interesting because water, I think, took me 3 months to write. Fire took me 3 months to write. And I can't remember water, and I can't remember air, but earth took me a year to write.
Oh, wow.
Because I couldn't, I thought, I can't write the same thing everybody writes about earth. Earth. And I had to go to a place that I knew earth in another way, but it took me a year because it took so long to articulate what I was seeing when I was in earth, whereas fire just went, ta-da, like that.
I love that.
Yeah.
Brilliant. And one of the things I like is that you really tried to go back to some of the early sources, and maybe that's where we could start is in early Greek philosophy and like pre-Socratic philosophy circa the 6th and 5th century BCE. That's really where the story of the elements, at least in the Western tradition, kind of begins more or less, right? With different philosophers trying to posit that there's some sort of underlying principle or some principle underlying the universe.
Yeah. I'm slightly, sounds like I'm deviating, but I'm not. But I work with historical cycles a lot. And in the 5th century BC, for a period of time, I think it's 444 to I don't know, 28 or something. I'm sorry, I can't. But anyway, it's that period. Pluto's in Capricorn and Neptune is in Pisces. So when I started looking at these historical periods, Pluto in Capricorn, Neptune in Pisces, 6 times in the last 3,000 years, when I got to that period, there was Empedocles. And,
Mm.
and, and it wasn't, I don't think it's before him. I think what I love about each of these periods is the way that we've seen things collectively together is starting to break down or melt down or collapse, and a new way of seeing collectively is arising somehow. And in this period, there's Anaxagoras, and he says nous. Everything is nous. All from the gods down to the stones is this word he uses, mind or something, whatever you want to call it. And he gets in trouble so much that he's going to be executed for heresy. And Pericles saves him, and then he has to leave town, and then he learns to square the circle and all of that. But at the same time, Empedocles is saying that everything is fire, earth, air, and water. And these 4 roots and I think he says all mortal things. I don't think he says immortal things. I think it's all mortal things. He says are separated and articulated by nikos, strife, let us say, and blended and brought together by philia, by love. So love and strife, you can use those 2 words, are the ones that move them all around in different relationships to each other. Now, he doesn't get into trouble, whereas Anaxagoras does. And I think it's because he behaved as if he was very eccentric. And he didn't act like, I am a philosopher and I am teaching you things. You are learning things. I am from the Pythagorean tradition and we are taking ourselves seriously. He sort of acted really strange. And so he got away with it. And how is it that he said these 4 things and they went so powerfully, they just went down through history. And everyone after them talked about them. I think it's Plato who said called them elements, but
Right.
like letters or something.
Yeah, so Empedocles is calling them like roots.
Yeah.
But then eventually Plato takes over the idea from Empedocles and starts calling them elements,
That's
using
right.
the same word that's used to refer to a letter of the alphabet,
Yeah.
because a letter is like the smallest component that makes up words and sentences.
That's interesting. Yeah. I think I know more about Empedocles' work on it than I know about Plato's. I mean, because we've been talking about this for a few days, I thought, I must look at Plato, but I didn't have a chance somehow.
Mhm.
So I don't know what else he said about them as much as I do about, Empedocles is clearer for me
Sure.
somehow.
Let's
Yeah.
stick with Empedocles for a little bit. So Empedocles is taking over some ideas from the earlier pre-Socratics that you're talking about. So there's
Yeah.
Thales, who says that everything is water, or the principle underlying everything is water, and
Yeah.
there's Anaximenes, who says it's air, and there's
Yeah.
Heraclitus that says it's fire.
Fire. That's right.
But then Empedocles comes in and says, no, there's 4
Yeah.
underlying principles, and these 4 roots are earth, air, fire, and water, and they are, like you said, continuously being articulated by these 2 opposing qualities of love that brings things together, and strife
Yes.
that pulls things apart.
Yes. And what I read this, I don't know where I read this again, it's a while ago, but that strife separates and articulates them. I think that's really interesting, because and love, or philia, brings them together and blends them. I like the notion of that articulation, and I don't know if that's in one of his fragments. It might be, because we get his fragments periodically. Empedocles. Is he the one that then brought in earth? Because I don't remember anyone before that saying earth. Did he add earth, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. At least the other major ones were just water, air, and fire. So maybe Empedocles was the one bringing in that 4th.
Yeah. And I think in other cultures they were coming in too. But again, I get interested in something, and I've just started looking at that. I think other cultures were talking about those fire, earth, air, and water, and then something else as well, a 5th element as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in like Chinese medicine, they have like wood and metal or something like that. But
That's
this is
right.
one of the instances where certainly in the Western tradition and in terms of Western horoscopic astrology, this is one of the areas where it was definitely influenced in a very specific way by
Yes.
Greek philosophy and some of
Yes.
the trends within Greek philosophy in the first few centuries BCE.
Yes. Yes. And then it goes down and gets in later, it gets mixed up with the temperaments as well, caught up. And I mean, the thing that what happened is, I mean, like, I don't like boxing things and putting them in boxes. So,
Mm,
oh, therefore you are air, therefore you are sanguine. Somehow I like the notion of them together, dancing together in a way.
mm,
But that you are this because your sun is that. I can't do that somehow.
sure.
So, yeah. And
So
also, yeah,
yeah, so let's get there then in terms of talking about the qualities, because that will bring us through the rest of the history. So Plato takes over the idea and he talks about it in the Timaeus, and he
yeah,
associates the elements with geometrical shapes, and specifically interesting the
that's right.
shape of a triangle, which is interesting because somebody later took that idea of the elements being associated with triangles and applied that to the zodiac, to each of the
Oh,
triangles or the
aha.
triplicities, which are the
Yes,
groups of signs into four sets of three.
yes.
Um,
And
and
who does that? Somebody specifically does that. Who says Aries, Aries, Leo, Sag, fire. But I can't remember. Is it Porphyry? Is it that? Is it later like that? They're literally, or Gallons or somebody? Is it?
Yeah, I think what happened actually, because I published a paper in 2012 where I think I was the first person to ever point this out to show how the four elements came to be assigned the signs of the zodiac, because that's one of the mysteries is that not all authors did assign the elements to the signs of the zodiac. Let me share a diagram just so
Okay.
people watching the video version know what we're talking about. So this is the traditional
Yeah,
for
that's
basically
good.
most of the past 2000 years. These are the assignments where you have the three fire signs, which are
Mm.
Aries, Leo, and
Sag.
Sagittarius,
Yeah,
the earth signs, which are Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn,
yeah,
the air signs, which are Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius,
yeah.
and then the four water signs, or the water triplicity as it's called, which is Cancer, Scorpio, and
Scorpio.
Pisces.
Yes.
So, some ancient Hellenistic authors, or Greek authors, basically, who wrote in Greek during the time of the Roman Empire, some of them start mentioning this scheme, like Vedius Valens mentions it, and Rhetorius of Egypt mentions it, but other famous authors like Claudius Ptolemy don't mention
Doesn't.
it.
No, not at all. Yeah, that's
Um,
interesting.
but I think I was able to trace it back through this paper on the planetary joys to whoever came up with the triplicity rulership scheme, which is like an alternative system for assigning rulers over certain signs of the zodiac. Whoever came up with that scheme seems to have introduced this association.
Hmm.
So the title of the paper that I wrote on this was "The Planetary Joys and the Origins of the Significations of the Houses and Triplicities."
Mm.
It's too complicated to get into here, but it probably means that sometime around the first century BCE, there was a Hermetic text that first came up with these assignments and proposed them, and
Mm.
some astrologers incorporated the concept and embraced it, and other astrologers were kind of standoffish and didn't incorporate it. But eventually, after the medieval period, it became a universal, commonly accepted concept.
Yes. And it's really interesting. It's once it's in you, it's hard not to see it that way. I mean, like I remember, where was I? Was it in Joburg? Maybe it was early days of being in Johannesburg in the 70s. And I remember walking down the street with a guy, and he had 6 planets in fire. He told me he had
Mm,
3 in Sagittarius and 2 in Leo and 1 in Aries. Da da da. And I remember, and he was talking and talking. He was telling me about things. And I remember feeling that fire so powerfully.
mm,
And then later in the evening, I spent time with a woman, and she had something like 4 or 5 planets in water. And I remember just the difference of the feeling. And I remember thinking about that fire I don't remember anything about him except the feeling. I know I was in Durban. I was visiting someone in Durban. I can remember walking along the street, and I remember thinking, if you have all that fire, you must find a way to bring it down. I remember thinking that he's got to be able to bring it down. And I worried for him because there was so much passion and so much vision and so much. What I think about fire is I said, Henri Corbin, he talks about the imaginal plane. And at the highest level, it's for me, fire is the connecting to that imaginal plane, which is beyond air. Air articulates it if it can, but it's as close as you can get to that which is beyond the density of time and space. And I remember those 6 planets in fire and being worried about him because I thought, how is he going to bring it down to be able to manifest it in something that is, denser in some way, And then the evening, being with that water person, the feelings of when I left, I felt as though I'd been in the ocean for hours and hours, and I loved the difference of the feeling of the two. And she felt safer to me, even though she was very depressed and for some of it, but she was so there with herself in a particular way. And so I've always thought when you have a lot of one, the work is how you bring it into, how you connect it up with something else, whether comfortably or uncomfortably, so that you're not just in that plane, in that dimension somehow. They feel like dimensions to me in some way. Yeah.
So I guess what the concept is, if we we're trying to explain it to somebody, is that there's a commonality or a similarity between these groupings of 3 signs of the zodiac, and that they have this underlying quality, or what was the term that you just used?
I said a dimension.
A dimension, yeah. They have like
an energy field. They're like different energy fields in a way. Well, especially when you're talking about fire. As soon as you say fire, I think of an energy field. But there are different dimensions of reality that express themselves in what I lately call the density of time and space. And fire seems the closest to beyond that density. So that if you think of somebody like Teresa of Avila, she's got Sun conjunct Uranus in Aries in the 1st house, and Venus in Pisces in the 12th. And the combination of that fire and water took her to places that she almost would rather not have gone. They were so unconventional, let us say, or not. They took her to these other places of ecstasy, and I think fire can take you to these places of ecstasy because they touch that space beyond, But then you have to find how to live here with that when you have lots of fire, or when people have lots of fire. I'm thinking of a friend of mine in Joburg, and he's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 planets in fire. And when he phones, or when we speak to each other, and we still do after being away for however it's 40 years or something now, but we still speak. I have to wait for the first 10 minutes for him to, tell me all the, and then we can have a conversation somehow, and I love the places he goes,
Right, because fire kind of can come alive very quickly and burn up and become very bright, but then it can also kind of burn out quickly if it's not fed or sustained continuously. Its inherent tendency is to flare up quickly and burn bright, and then to die out quickly.
Yes, and also it gets so close to that other space and coming back down into the density, like the world is in a very transitional, disturbed space at the moment. So at the moment, he's talking about, he's not, and he keeps saying, why don't people, and why don't people live at this level of beauty and, and joy, and he finds it so difficult, the kind of crawling density of all these planets and Earth that we're having to deal with somehow.
Mm.
Yeah. But he's a
Uh,
painter, and a wonderful painter, and that keeps him sane. He can bring the vision down with his paint. And I think when you have fire, you've got to have a place to be able to manifest that which you have to bring it somewhere, to either you have to through earth perhaps, or through air. And I'm not sure through water. I think they're very similar, and that they have to be connected to something else to function in a way that's okay, if I put it that way,
mm.
because they take you to a place that's so not rational and practical, you know.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that actually might connect with two other things in terms of just the historical development of all of this. So after Plato, we get Aristotle, and Aristotle
Yes.
introduces some notions. One of them that's kind of relevant to something you were saying is the idea of natural place, where he said that each of the elements has an inherent natural motion, an inherent natural tendency either to move upwards or to move downwards. And
Mm-hmm.
those are the primary things that the elements do in terms of their part of their inherent qualities. And that's kind of interesting in terms of what you were just saying, because fire is the one that has the tendency to rise up the
Oh yeah.
highest to the
Yeah.
uppermost portions of the cosmos,
Yeah.
whereas air also rises up, but it then settles just below fire. Earth falls, it's the densest, and it falls towards the bottom of the cosmos, or the center of
Yeah.
the cosmos. And then water also falls downwards, but it rests just above Earth because it's
Yeah.
slightly less dense.
Yes. And it's interesting because if I look at those like that, I immediately think air almost like has to articulate fire, or it seeks to articulate fire, perhaps. It's
What do you mean by articulate?
I think of air as always trying to understand things, trying to
Mm,
find words for things, trying to communicate with things, trying to make um, uh, like the difference between fire comes in images, I think,
mhm.
and air seeks as far as I understand, the words to articulate the images somehow. Um,
Sure.
and yeah, and if I
It's
look at
sort of,
water and earth, it's a similar thing, but on a different level. What were you going to say?
yeah, so it's almost like fire and earth set up the two extremes, but then air is acting as an intermediary between
That's it.
the
Yeah,
realm of fire and
yeah,
the more grounded or
that's it.
solid, tangible world of water and earth. Whereas
Yes,
water, to some extent, is also acting as an intermediary between earth
absolutely.
and the other two elements.
Well, it was just as you put them there, I thought it's like, I suppose I'm using old-fashioned words, and I
Hmm.
haven't got new ones for it, but like fire has is like listening to the spirit of things, and air tries to articulate that or express it or describe it or something, and water has a feeling of this. It touches again something beyond time and space. It touches into something, the soul of things, and then it's expressed through, or it mixes with earth in a particular way, and things are created and made literally, so it's like the water is the soul of the earth, and the fire is the spirit of the air in some way, and that's why I think they're similar. Fire and not similar, sorry, wrong, but they're these other dimensions, and they need to be expressed through air easily and one through earth easily. Because what does water do with those feelings? I'm very close to water people, and I'll say, but what are you feeling? And it's always like it takes time to be able to find out what they're to be able to express what they're feeling, because they have to go inward to get there somewhere.
Mm.
Water does not easily express that which is fundamental to it. This moving, this sort of constantly changing, and when it gets too stuck, when it's not changing all the time, it gets stagnant. But how does it come to terms with it? So water and fire, in a way, are more difficult, if I can put it that way. They have to find ways to express themselves.
Right. One of the things that's interesting also about this, and maybe we should briefly digress on, is just the idea of what we're talking about here is these archetypal qualities. And this really goes back to the very idea of what an archetype is as like an overarching principle that's existing underneath reality or maybe above reality on some level, but that then lots of sub-concepts are actually being derived from. And I can't think of any like broader archetype than the elements,
Yes.
and these four fundamental principles or qualities or roots.
Roots, yes. I love it's really interesting. Roots, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, I just said something. I said fire and water, it's more difficult. I don't mean that if you have planets in fire and water, it's harder. But I mean, they have to find places through which to express, whereas it seems to me earth and air naturally do it. It's the articulation, one in material things like this, and the other in the words that you and I are using. It's a natural thing to make sense of them, in a sense. But fire and water have to. It's almost as if they. What is it? They have to come through something in a way. And yeah. I'm going too far in my head.
How do you usually define like an archetype, or what's your conceptualization of an archetype?
I know. I thought about that earlier because I thought we were going to talk about archetypes. God.
I mean, you tend to be more influenced by like the Jungian school in terms of that conceptualization of archetypes on some level, right? Is that
probably
true?
But it's a long time now since I've been reading that. I've been away from it in a way.
Sure.
I might be wrong about this, but are the archetypes? I thought earlier when we were speaking, I thought, do I really know what an archetype is anymore? It's like a form of some kind that we all recognize. Like I've lived in other cultures, very deeply in other cultures. And there were certain things that were absolutely, we recognized, like beauty, and we may have had different ideas about beauty, but we knew when somebody said that's beautiful, everyone knew that we were talking about something universal and at an imaginal level. So I suppose to me, an archetype is it's something that what do I say? It's that which we shape differently through culture, but there's certain forms that are part of our inner imaginal world, or no, part of our collective imaginal world.
Sure. Or even to give a less abstract example, like even like a tree, I think is a really common example, like that there is such thing as a tree, or like the essence of a tree in our mind on some level, but the specifics of like what different trees look like may be different, but they all share some sort of commonality if you're talking about the concept of a tree.
Oh, that's interesting. And also like gods, deity, like that's even more natural, almost like, everyone knows what that means, but how they specify that and whether they like it or not, nowadays the religion of atheism is quite big at the moment, in our culture anyway. But everyone knows what you're talking about when you talk about the gods or deity or so both something as practical or as material as a tree, and yet something as far away as a god. Those are archetypes. So archetypes are the form of things or something.
Right. So the ultimate underlying, not abstract, but sort of a conceptual form that exists above something, underlying all of the particular things that are manifestations of that form in the material world.
Yes.
So, and I guess the point of that was just that I think there's no broader, the archetype is where of the elements. When you start getting into elements, it seems like you're getting into really high level archetypes of trying to take everything back to four fundamental qualities or principles from which you derive just innumerable other
Yes.
specific manifestations. But that can also be one of the challenges sometimes in talking about the elements, is they can be so fundamental or so primary as archetypes that it can be difficult to articulate that, because it can be
Yes.
so broad in what it's explaining or what it's covering.
Yes. Because if you say anything too specific, it almost doesn't, like, I want to say, like, earth signs are fundamentally practical. And then I think, is
Hmm.
that true? But an air sign can be practical in another kind of way. But
Hmm.
it's hard not to automatically think earth, when you've got earth signs, it's practical. There's a natural practicality. So this morning in the garden, we have a communal garden, and on Monday morning, a group of us in the community go there and keep it quite beautiful. And we were talking about what's going on in the world, the virus, and I know all their charts. They don't know what that means, but I know their charts. And I was listening to the Earth sign being irritated by everybody going on and on about this, just deal with it. It's fine. Just deal with it. And the water sign saying, I'm not sure, it's sort of no. So each of them feeling differently, or just expressing different tones about a collective thing, and each having, and then the fire sign making a joke about it, so we'd stop talking about it. And just to get us out of there with his Aries moon, he just said, okay. And he said something funny, and we all went off into a different direction. And so you can, when you know the fundamental elements of people's charts, you don't have to remember the degrees or the aspects. You can hear the element talking, and it's very satisfying, I think, to hear that, rather than saying what it is. You can listen to it or watch it,
Mm.
yeah. And it's
Right.
good to know it about the people close to you, because when you're fiery and airy, and you want your earthy, watery partner to tell you what they're feeling, you have to know that they have to take time to do that, you know. And when the fire airy person is saying what they're feeling, the earth and water has to know how to slow them down so that you can have a communication. So they're very useful just as background information, I think.
Sure. So both in terms of like self-reflection and understanding oneself and some of the overarching archetypal qualities that might manifest more prominently in your own life, but also in
Yes.
understanding as an access point for understanding other people and what their motivations or tendencies might be.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And it's a sense, not an analysis. It's not like, he is doing that because you get it, you can get it as it's like looking at a tree or looking at birds. They're both different, and looking at listening to a water person and then listening to a fire person on the phone, too, totally different energy,
Mm.
and it helps to be less judgmental when you have that sense of who they are. I'm always fascinated when I meet people and I'll say, about your friend or your somebody, do you know what's their chart? And I don't know. I never look at people close to me. And I think, how do you navigate without, knowing these things, so that when they do something, you can see that where they're coming from, in a sense, rather than having a notion yourself about how they should be somehow.
Mm.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
So let's back up a little bit and get into more of like the underlying qualities and talk about some of the core principles underlying each element, which maybe then we can apply to more specific delineations. One of the things that Aristotle did that was really useful is he said that because the elements are creating the perceptible bodies and like the world around us, that they should relate to one of the senses. And the sense that he ended up focusing on was the sense of touch. And he ended up associating these four different qualities with each of the elements, which were the sense of hot, cold,
Yes.
wet, and dry.
Yes.
And there's a little bit of an issue because his views actually may have changed during the course of his lifetime, and by the time he died, some of his assignments were changed up a little bit by his primary student and the guy that took over for his school, Theophrastus, and then the
Yes.
Stoics and the Hermetic philosophers also followed these reassigned qualities, but those qualities are basically as follows, where it assigns the quality of hot to fire,
That makes
and
sense.
it puts fire in opposition to air, where it assigns in the Stoic and the Hermetic system the quality of cold. Like when you blow on something in order to cool it down, or imagine like blowing out a fire or blowing out a
Mhm.
candle, for example. And water was given the primary quality of being wet or
That's
being moist, yeah, which is pretty
yeah. That
straightforward.
yeah. Those two, fire and water, are pretty straight. Yeah.
Yeah, and then earth is given in opposition to water the primary quality of being dry or drying things.
Mm.
So this then gets assigned very literally. So this is already in like Stoic philosophy by the 3rd and 4th century BCE, but then
Mm.
somebody in the 1st century BCE, when they were creating the different components of what we associate with Western astrology and with birth charts, they took these assignments and then they literally put the signs of the zodiac in order so that the fire signs would be on the opposite side of the zodiac wheel from the air signs, and the
Mm.
water signs would be on the opposite side of the zodiac wheel from the water signs, or the earth signs opposite water signs. So what you end up with then is the fire signs such as Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius are all opposite, which are hot, are all opposite to the air signs, which are cold. So air is Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius. And then all of the earth signs, which are dry, are opposite to water signs, which are wet. So, like Taurus is opposite to
Mm.
Scorpio, Virgo is opposite to Pisces, and so on and so forth. So, it creates this natural tensions between the signs where they have each sign has its element with its quality, but then you have an opposing element with an opposing quality directly in opposition to it.
Interesting. It just strikes me now without noticing. Um, I was saying how my natural inclination is that air expresses fire more easily than any other sign does, and earth expresses water, or connects with it or works with it more easily than any other. And I'm just noticing this. I wonder if it comes, it's from, because they're opposite each other, and they seem to communicate with each other more naturally in a way. Um, and
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know about the hot and dry and all of that. I'm not sure about that, but the earth and water, fire and air makes perfect sense. Yeah.
And there was actually in some of like the 2nd century astrologer Vedius Valens, he says something very similar about this oppositional quality actually being helpful
Yeah.
to each of the elements in some way. And I'm trying to find that quote really quickly. Yeah, actually, I'll skip over that because I'm having some noise issues in the background. But there's a notion that Valens talks about of like water helping to um, make earth less dry,
Yeah,
and therefore making it fertile so that you can grow things in the soil,
that's lovely. Absolutely
or
lovely.
earth giving form to water, because water tends to be very formless and tends to
Yes,
just adapt completely to whatever environment it is, so that it can
yes,
just spread out completely so that it's spread too thin. But if you put it in a container made of earth, like let's say a bowl, then water is suddenly shaped and given form. So even though they have opposing oppositional qualities that are almost the antithesis of each other, they can be helpful in that way in helping to give each other form and to um, give qualities that are actually useful to each other through that, rather than necessarily harmful.
opposite. Yeah. And also, I was just thinking, and this is because I was working on fire, earth, and water again recently, when I was doing the webinars. And when I came to water, it struck me that all water tends to go, no matter where it starts, it always ends up in the sea. It struck me, it's always seeking unity of some kind. And I thought about the three water signs too, in their own way, each seeking unity in different ways somehow. But once it gets to the sea, it then goes back up and then comes back down somewhere else and then seeks. It's always looking for. I'd never thought of that before, and I couldn't think of any other element that is seeking unity in that way. It was a new idea in some way. And the pain of being watery and not being able to get that unity. Sometimes the unity is with an idea, but sometimes it's with a group or a person or or God, whatever it is. But it's that wanting to go back to something almost. It's almost like wanting to go back to something in a way. And it comes down through the earth. And how does he say about air? Because I loved that articulation of earth with water, but how does he say air does with fire? Do you remember?
So I don't have the exact quote, but I summarize it on page 264 of my book, where I give sort of a summary of what Valens says. And what I wrote there was in my book, Hellenistic Astrology.
Yeah, I've got it over
say
there.
That he says that fire and air intermingle with each other since they both rise upwards. And in the process of doing so, fire, which is hot, is supported by the more mild temperature of the air, which is cold, while at the same time the air is warmed up by the heat of fire so that it does not become overly cold or frigid. So what he's saying is they're making each other more temperate, and temperance is, in some authors like Ptolemy, is actually their basic definition of something that's positive and constructive versus something that is negative and destructive, is that extremes can be unstable, whereas that which is temperate can be more stable and more conducive towards maintaining something in the long term.
Yes, and you wouldn't think of fire on its own as temperate in any way ever.
Right.
So yeah, but when those, I almost want to say images, I think of fire on three levels, I suppose. I think of the imaginal plane as the highest plane that Henri Corbin talks about, then the imagination, and then fantasy. And there are like three different levels of where one can go, with the fiery part of oneself. And they're probably most easily articulated, most easily expressed through air. And yet I've known, when I see a combination of fire and earth very strong, I always am interested, because in Africa I knew some people, different people with it, and when it's creative, it's amazing, because it has to take this image and put it into and make something out of it in the earth. And so a lot of the people I knew in the bush, the houses they built for themselves were extraordinary, they would tell you from one season to the next, I'm now going to do this and this and this, and then you'd see them do it in a way that was extraordinary. But it's not a comfortable, easy combination, fire and earth. But the creation of it is absolutely wonderful. Yeah. And the understanding of somebody with earth, with fire and water, it's not comfortable. But if they are conscious and working with themselves, their ability to understand something about life that goes beyond the neat little, clean little way we'd like life to be. They've felt everything and experienced so much that is not on these rational levels somehow. So that I always find that the uncomfortable things are the most interesting. They're just a drag if you want to be comfortable somehow.
Right. So let me see I'm trying to think of if we should touch on other underlying qualities for each of the four elements and what their primary natures are, or if we should focus on, I don't know, contrasting the signs of the zodiac in order to try to approach the elements and what they mean in the context of the actual signs. Yes. Do you have a feeling, like, for example, like we could talk about Earth, for example, being a very tangible quality, whereas you were talking about water and its tendency to unify things. Yes. And to bring things together.
To seek unity. Yeah, I was thinking about the water. um, like it's hard to get away from, like, it's harder to get away from a water parent, if you put it that way, because the Cancerian will create a container in which they want their family to stay. There's that unity thing, and it's hard to get away. So I always think of Cancerians as creating containers in which you will feel familiar. I'm not going to say safe necessarily, but familiar. And sometimes people don't want to get away from the familiar because it's scary, somehow. But Scorpio is a whole different thing. It's hard to get away as well, but it's hard to get away because your connection is so hidden and real. The Scorpio connection is at that place where you are most, I almost want to say vulnerable, but it might not be the right word. I don't think it's where you are most hidden. I always think of it as where the completely hidden part of yourself that the Scorpio touches in one way or another. And if you leave, you won't be seen at that level, for good or for bad. And it's hard to get away. And then with Pisces, you want to get away. You don't want to get away. You want to get away. You don't, the feeling of being, accepted, not seen necessarily, but accepted utterly, is the ultimate of Pisces planets when it works when it's working. It's like you're utterly, absolutely accepted and seen for whatever you are. And so there's this sense of being, I suppose, your whole self is caught up when you're when you're connected deeply to water people. It's almost as if the part of you, again, it's part of you that's hidden, whereas if you take fire, it's the part of you that manifests, that's loved, not the part that's hidden. So you're sitting with a water sign and you're held in a particular place, and you're sitting with a fire sign and you go together to a particular place. So there's
right. So water tends to envelop whatever it's around and to conform to it. I guess that's one of the underlying principles or qualities, is in enveloping, but also a sort of conforming or adapting. It's adaptable.
That's interesting.
Like, I'm trying to think of an example of that. Like if you have like a bucket of water and you like drop something in it, the water will be displaced and will like sort of move around it and conform to whatever that thing is.
I don't know if that, I just think, what I'm seeing is that when you are close to water, it touches something in you that is unworded and unseen, and it touches it at a level that when you leave, you're left. You're almost, the feeling, it's like you can be abandoned almost, because you've been touched and seen, experienced so deeply that it's hard to leave. And I would say with Cancerian, the container, and but it's hard to leave that atmosphere of being seen so deeply in a way that other people don't see you. So I don't know. I don't know about the conforming. I just know it's you're touched in a particular way that's very, very private, I think, with water. Yeah. Whereas if you think of air, you have conversations, you connect, you share, but at such a different level. The water level, there's no words for, unless it's poetry. Right. Yeah.
So it's almost like there's an emotional component to water in its connecting of things, whereas there's more of an emotional, or let's say a feeling way of connecting things through water, whereas with air, it's also something that's conveying something, but it's conveying more like information or ideas or thoughts or words. Mm-hmm. So it's also got that sense of conveying something, but doing it in a colder sense, or which is more of an intellectual sense rather than in a feeling sense.
Like I would say a cooler sense, if I put it that way, rather than colder, because colder has immediately made me have a judgment about that, but it's cooler, and it's It's like I'm just thinking in the morning, the air signs telling us what exhibitions we must go to on Friday, because we're going to an exhibition on Friday. At the British Museum, there's an exhibition of Troy. And no, but you must go here and you must go there. And yes, have you been? And have you been? And have you been? And you said the word information. It's sharing and expressing information. Whereas the water, it's connecting, touching something. And often it's touching something that was part of you as a child, because there's something about memory in water as well. And so it touches something very deep. And that goes back to before you had words. Yeah. And sometimes it's painful and sometimes it's beautiful, but it touches that. Whereas air is touching now, the possibilities right now, what's going on now. It's right here, and it's cool. Yeah.
I like that, as water being that which is without words.
Yes.
I think air is much more wordy.
Music. Proust, of course. I used him. I was looking at my books because we were talking last week, and I used Proust, whom I loved. I only read the whole of the first volume, but I didn't read all of them. But his whole thing about memory, he got me into the understanding something about it, that water takes you back to pre-verbal. Well, he didn't say that, of course, but to the time when you were nothing but feeling, nothing, just feeling, and safety. Safety and feeling were everything it was about. And so water a water person either brings you into that place of safety, or makes you feel very unsafe, but makes you feel. And the difficulty in our culture is feeling is not, you're supposed to be fine all the time. So it's difficult. How do you have to have places. I always say to my water clients, you must have time where you feel all the emotions that came through the day, so that you can sleep well, so that you must give yourself space to go through the feelings and let them go back to the ocean somehow. Otherwise they build up, and the smallest thing can have a storm, just because there's been too much feeling let's say unreflected somehow. Something about reflection in water as well. It requires reflection.
I like that, reflection. Okay, that's another good keyword.
Yeah.
So contrasting all of this with air, which tends to be more intellectual, which really comes out, like I'm thinking of different ways that people express like nurturing, because this is where this comes out often in astrology, is how people with, let's say, a lot of water sign placements might relate to you if you come to them with a problem. Yes. In maybe being more empathetic or having an ability to emote, or just be there, be present with you on an emotional level, versus, like, let's say you're talking to somebody with a lot of air sign placements, and they might have a tendency to try to intellectualize
to understand
the emotional
you.
thing.
Yeah. Help you understand it. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And yesterday I was going through something, and I spoke to two people, and they said, "How are you?" I said, and the earth sign tried to help me what to do so I could feel better.
Okay, and so they try to give you like a practical advice for what you should do.
Exactly. And I ended up going, and even though I love this person, and the Aquarian, but with lots of water, with just said, and afterwards I said, how do you manage not to try and help me understand? And she said, I learned that from you a very long time ago. It doesn't work. So what she'd done is she'd gone straight into her water self to listen to me moaning. And then by the end of the conversation, we were laughing about things and enjoying ourselves. And that's what I love about that water. You can go there, and then you can come out and go somewhere else. But I think you have to be able to have the courage in a culture that doesn't honor emotions in the same way as some other cultures do, to be able to dare to feel the feelings so that you can have compassion. And perhaps compassion has to do with water.
compassion as a water trait. I could see that.
Yeah.
And something we didn't mention, which also comes from the Stoic theories, is that earth and water are more quote unquote passive elements, whereas
Oh,
fire and air are supposed to be more active elements, which you might, in a modern sense, associate with like introversion versus extroversion, perhaps, if that's applicable.
yeah. I don't know if that's, I'd have to think about that introversion, extroversion, but I think that's probably true because um, an air person who's in a group of people and doesn't have a good conversation will probably suffer more than an earth person if the food is good and the atmosphere is good. They're okay, more about it. Not just the sun I'm talking, but I'm talking about a lot of planets. So um, I think air needs the communication somehow, and the contact. And so, I mean, if I'm dealing with airy people who are shy because of other things, I'm always thinking about how to help them learn to articulate themselves in a way that they can be in communication with other people. Because if other things get in the way of that ability to communicate, that's very hard. Those air planets are about communication, as far as I can see. There was a quote I used to have on my diaries, and it was, "The depth is on the surface." I think it's Yeats that says it. I think somebody said it to me years ago, and I just loved it. Having planets in Gemini, I loved that you can have I love having a totally superficial conversation in a queue at the airport. And yet when we get to the thing, we've actually talked about things that were deeper by talking about things on the surface, and the combination of that. And there's something about each of the signs, like Gemini, talk about anything. The only crime really for a Gemini is for somebody to bore you, go on and on, talk at you rather than with you. But Libra has to learn to. It's different. It's almost like it has to learn to the dance of communication, that not to give itself totally to the other person, to learn to how to go back and forth. And once it learns that, it's very satisfying. And I always think of Aquarians that, like, if an Aquarian is feeling edgy or agitated, all I have to do is go down to the shop, have a conversation with the stranger behind the counter, come back home, and it's okay. The need to be amongst people that you haven't had a conversation with much before, or who's out there. So there are 3 levels of conversation, or of interaction, let's say. And I think, I don't know, do you think they always need to be learning things? I'm not sure if all 3 of them.
Yeah, potentially, but maybe in different areas. Like Gemini is more like learning facts or learning small, discrete things and communicating
Or
them, especially.
languages. Or
Yeah,
languages.
languages. I always like so I have several friends that have like the moon in Gemini and they have a way with languages. And I've
Yeah,
always very much am jealous of their ability to pick up new languages or
yeah,
learn languages easily as a result of that. So there's
yeah.
that component with Gemini. With Libra, it seems like it's more social and learning social cues and being like masters of social cues in some ways.
Oh, that's interesting. Yes.
Whereas Aquarius, I often think of Saturn as the traditional ruler and their ability where they can sometimes excel at like community organizing or organizing a group of people around the same message or around a similar like ideal or goal.
Mm. And also the Aquarian thing, I think I'm again going back in time, probably about 40 years ago or something. And a young Aquarian said to me at a gathering of people, the sun or something, said to me, "You know what I'd like?" And I said, "What?" He said, "I would like at some point to have to speak at least one sentence or one conversation with every single person on the earth."
Mm.
And I went, doing, the love of the other, the one out there. And you're right. Of course, it's about the community as well.
Mm.
And it's often with lots of planets in Aquarius, it's often easier with strangers or with people in the community than it is with intimates. The need to have air, to be able to breathe, beyond the home. It's so not water, in that sense.
Sure. So
Yeah,
it's social, and one of the things that's interesting about all of these is you can also get a much clearer idea of some of them by contrasting it with the opposite.
yeah,
So Aquarius as the opposite sign to Leo,
Leo, yeah,
and the air sign of Aquarius and its social tendencies versus Leo as a fire sign and its creative tendencies, but also its focus more intensely on like the self, as its primary locus or like reference point, as opposed to maybe Aquarius, which is more focused on the community of others.
yes. That's interesting because I had a conversation with WhatsApp conversation with somebody um, in another country, a younger person, and she had a difficulty with somebody. She's a Leo with Moon in Aquarius,
Mm,
and she this person hadn't done the right thing, and said to me, "Please." So I just wrote a few words about how that person might be feeling in the community because of X, Y, and Z. And she wrote back immediately, the next day, because she's in another time zone, and wrote back and said, I got it. Thank you. I got it. And I've noticed that with her, she does, the Leo thing is very strong. This is the right way, and this is the good way. And, I think of Leo as the heart, is the fire in the center of the hut. These wonderful African huts, they were quite big, and in the middle was a fire. And I think of Leo like when the fire is the right height, everyone is illuminated. But if the fire is too low, everyone's cold. And if the fire is all about me, too high, everyone disappears. But when a Leo has the right illumination, their heart is in the room, everyone is illuminated in some way. And but her fire had gotten too hot somehow,
mm,
and then giving her reasons of why this person might be out. The air took it, and then she came back and was fine again. And it's hard, that combination, I think, because one is so here, this is the way it is, and the other is constantly needing to be attentive to all of the people in the community somehow. But when it works, it works, of course, like when these oppositions, when it suddenly works, it works beautifully because then she could give her heart again, you know. Yeah.
yeah, I like that, and also fire naturally, when well maintained or at like a okay level, naturally attracts people around it, and people naturally congregate around it, so that it becomes like the locus or the center of attention just as a result of being itself or
Yeah,
expressing itself
exactly.
naturally.
Yeah, absolutely. And particularly Leo, I don't know why, for me, it is the center of the not, it's not a hut. I can't remember the word we used to use for it, a lapa. Anyway, it's the center of the round home somehow. But Sagittarius is interesting. It took me a long time, I suppose, to get. I mean, Sagittarius is a whole different thing because it's on its way. It's. I mean, I think of it as the philosopher, the lover of wisdom, trying to understand something. But it's the priest and
Mm,
that which is sensing that which is beyond the density of time and space,
mm,
and trying to bring it down. And the difficulty is when it stands on a high horse and knows, and preaches and everything. But when it doesn't do that, it brings you into contact with that which is beyond your understanding,
mm,
that and operates as the priest, the mediator between the invisible, eternal, and the density of time and space. Um, and I most something about Sagittarius in general it's a visionary, I suppose. And there's something about it that's quite they don't I think of them as you can take a balloon and push it under the water, but as soon as you take your hands off, it'll always come up.
mm,
They don't they come back up easy. They do have a philosophical something happening inside. What does my friend say? There's some cliche. I've got a friend and he's got 5 planets in Sag or 4 planets in Sag, and he's always coming up with these sentences to keep you going, somehow, and in an amusing way, which is also lovely. Yeah.
Yeah, and how I'm trying to think then, so Sagittarius is as a fire sign is opposite to Gemini as an air sign, and the way that they contrast, because
Yes.
Gemini can be much better at just conveying information and talking, and
Yes.
sometimes even talking on a surface level, whereas Sagittarius seems like it's more focused on big picture type
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. And Gemini, um, it's like you always want to say Gemini gives the information and Sagittarius turns it into something that has meaning
Mm,
one way or another, whether you like the meaning or agree with the meaning or not, that's a whole nother thing. But it's been there, it's on its way there. It's been there. It's going there. And Gemini's here in the neighborhood. I suppose now I'm suddenly seeing them in terms of the houses. I'm seeing third house, ninth house. So the neighborhood, the neighbors for the third house. I'm connecting up the Gemini with the third house, and on my way in a ship somewhere else, or a plane somewhere else. Um, and only Gemini without, I suppose, that maybe there's something about when you have a lot of planets in one sign, you almost have to go to the other place to keep yourself balanced in a way, even if you don't have planets in that other self. So a Gemini who doesn't look for meaning ever, not such a good thing. And a
mhm.
Gemini and a Sagittarius who has these ideas but isn't about communicating.
Right, like the philosopher that goes off in the woods to meditate for like 40 years but never comes back to share what
That's
they found.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So maybe the alternatives, the opposites are there, so that one, um, there to be the bringer back or something, or the bringer into the. I always think of oppositions. They really do have to do with struggles with other people, whereas squares really are struggles with yourself,
Mm.
somehow. But the oppositions, they are like having a conversation with the other element, and it keeps you sane, perhaps. Yeah,
Yeah, I like that. Nowhere is that clearer than with like the first house, seventh house axis, where you have your
absolutely.
rising sign and you have
Yeah,
the element that dominates your own personality and tendencies and characteristics, but then you have the seventh house and the sign on the descendant with
yes,
its opposing elemental quality that dominates your relationships, or sometimes the types of individuals that either you are attracted towards or
yeah.
attract towards you.
Yes, I like that opposition too, because I always think, I keep thinking I must do something on the ascendant descendant axis just because I want to get back into thinking about it, because you have no idea what other people see. I think with the ascendant, you have to really work to see what it is other people see. So often you don't know why people either like you or don't like you, because that first house it's there, But I think of the seventh house as the way you set up your drawing room, if I use English language, English's way of saying it, or the living room, or whatever you want to call it. And people who come in to that place and can be there, then you can communicate with them. Whether you get intimate with them or not depends on what happens in the eighth house. Whether you go through the door on the other side of the room. But the seventh house seems to be the way people come next to you, and that's what they feel, that seventh house energy. It's how you've set it up in some way, or how um, and it's the opposite. It's there to teach you something about how to be yourself and other, not just yourself and not just other. Yeah, hard to learn, but important.
Yeah, and it raises a question that I sometimes still wonder about, which is how much those qualities in the seventh house, like let's say, especially if a person doesn't have any planets in the seventh house, how much are those qualities that are already inherent in the individual versus how much are those qualities that the individual may lack but may import into their life. So there's one of those common concepts that
Mm.
astrologers have in modern astrology about if you have an excess of elements in one set of signs, or more importantly, if you have a deficiency or a lack of elements, planets in certain elements, then you might import or draw people into your life
Yeah,
that have those placements or have that element dominant in their chart in order to somehow balance out things in your own life.
absolutely. I agree completely. I've seen that again and again with um, couples.
Hmm.
Very little of this, a lot of that, and that. like a relationship, no matter how long it is, there's always that which you have to struggle with. It's part of the whole nature of it. It keeps you sensitive to each other. But that difference is again and again. And when I was young, I'd see it and I'd think, ugh, how are these people gonna, And now there's nothing that I see that I know can't work if the people in there are wanting it or willing for it to somehow. Anything can work. There's no aspect that you can't have this in a couple. You can't have this opposition. And you've just said something that makes me think about something. When there's nothing of an element in the chart, no water or no fire or no earth or no air, and when there's one, because people often say, a friend of mine said it years ago, and it was the first time she said, "Oh, I have nothing in Earth." I said, "You've got Pluto in Virgo." She said, "Oh, that doesn't count. It's an outer planet." I said, "It's incredibly," and I started watching. And when you have nothing in a sign, it's interesting. My experience is that either you're very good at that element and it happens naturally, or you're not good at all. It's sort of extreme. So I know people with no Earth who are hopeless. And I know people with no Earth who, I don't know how they do it. It's not the way everyone else does, but the way they build gardens or homes or just absolutely beautiful. So there's that. And when you have one planet in a sign, no matter whether it's personal or impersonal, that planet has a huge voice. It's like, I say it this way, it's like having one son and 9 daughters, or one daughter and 9 sons. That one it doesn't show up all the time, but when it does, it's got so much power. So I don't think nothing or one is the same, and I think whether it's personal or transpersonal doesn't matter. It's still going to have its voice if there's one. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. I like that. And so that brings up other placements, like if you have 7th house placements. One of the ones that's always interesting to me is when like the sun is in the 7th house, and sometimes the person tends to find their own identity through relationships, and sometimes, especially initially in relationships, taking on sometimes too much or going to extremes, the identity of sort of adopting what their partner likes, and that becomes part of their personal identity, or adopting elements of their partner's personality before eventually balancing things out and finding themselves again eventually. So that's probably tied up in some of this dynamic with the elemental qualities involved in those signs.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot lately because I have several friends in different countries who have planets in the 7th house, and all of the ones I know are on their own. And all of them at some point, I'm talking about people in their 60s and 70s now, and all of them at some point were in relationship. And I asked one of them the other day, and she's got 3 or 4 planets in Taurus in the 7th house. And I said, how do you have these planets in the 7th house? And because I've known her 40 years or something, so we've talked of it. And she said, I didn't know, I gave myself away too much when I was young to other people. And one day I learned that I had to have a relationship with myself. And so that relationship has become very important. And she has friends who adore her, and she loves her friends, but she loves closing the door and going inside, and she's back in relationship with herself. And she's a yoga teacher. So her relationship with 4 planets in Taurus. And so her relationship is with the body that she is. And then I've thought about the other ones, and they have incredibly developed relationships with themselves, which surprises me, because I would think with all those planets with planets in the 7th, they'd always be in relationship to others. But the ones that I've known have found a way to be in relationship with themselves. And she's got chances to be in relationship, in a sexual relationship with others, but she says, no, friendships are wonderful. And sometimes partnerships and teaching are wonderful. But my relationship is with this. And I thought that was interesting. It's still about relationship, but it's with the one she says is herself,
Yeah, that's really interesting. I love that.
Isn't that interesting? So surprising. Yeah. Yeah.
So let's see. So we touched on Aquarius, Leo. We've touched on Gemini, uh, Sagittarius, and then also, of
Cancer,
course.
Capricorn.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
That's a good one for now.
Yeah, that's one's been super highlighted in terms of the transits lately. So we have the water sign Cancer, and we have the earth sign Capricorn.
Yeah.
So
I think of Capricorn as creating the structure in which the Cancerian energy can have children. I think of the Cancerian energy as the cave, and where the people are kept safe, and the Capricorn is the structure that holds the community together somehow, and they're so necessary for each other somehow. But the Capricorn thing for me, everything, it's about holding the world together so that the vulnerable people, the babies, can be safe and can grow. And now with all these planets in Capricorn, everything is so unsafe. And I've never, ever, in all the years I've been doing charts, had people ask me again and again, do you think I'll be safe? Will I be safe? Will my son be safe? Will my daughter be safe? Will we be safe? Will we get our mortgage? Everyone is, the safety thing is huge at the moment, because the Capricorn world is not keeping us safe. It's breaking apart and reshaping itself in some way. It's a period in history. It's just nobody's doing it on purpose. It's a historical moment. But the sense of when Capricorn doesn't have this automatic just making it work, quietly making it work, yikes, it's so uncomfortable. And it's each little person who's, it's almost like the child is unsafe in some way in each person. And then they get angry, and resentful, and all of the things that everyone is getting. Yeah.
Sure. So yeah, I like that. So the idea of Capricorn creating the structure, a Saturn-ruled Earth sign, and the tangibility of it, but also the forward momentum and the tendency
Yes.
to build things that are concrete, versus Cancer being more of a water sign ruled by the moon, and the more internalized or like nurturing tendencies of that,
Yes.
especially as a water sign.
Yes. 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 I mean, you can't have a mother and child unless you have a system in the community that makes sure they're okay. They're so. I mean, I suppose first and seventh and fourth and 10th are so obvious, aren't they? That maybe because they're the quadrant somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
But I suppose all of them are obvious if you start looking at them, how they are necessary to each other. So, and I mean, I love Capricorns, but it's how to get them to come back to the absolutely personal small self, rather than just being in that have to, should, must self. They're necessary for each other to go back and forth again. Even if you have planets in Capricorn, even if you don't have them in Cancer, you still have to go back to stay whole to the small self and see who it is, and then come back into the world again. Yeah.
Okay. One of the things that's interesting, I always think about the Saturn ruled signs, but especially maybe Capricorn, is the tendency sometimes the critical tendency of Saturn, and a tendency to reject or exclude things in some ways, whereas Cancer is very much the opposite tendency, because it tends to be much more inclusive and much more trying to bring things or people together in some way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you can see the judgment in Capricorn. It's harder to see it in Aquarius, but it's still there. The I know. A friend of mine who's Aquarius says, "Remember, I know." And the judgment is when people don't behave properly, in the best sense, according to their own ideals. Because Aquarius is very much about an ideal of how people should behave. That Saturn is so, you can see it so clearly in Aquarius. I grew up in America as an astrologer, and therefore the Aquarius was Uranus, and the Scorpio was Pluto, and I didn't have any of those other ones. And when I came to this country, I was shocked. And now, of course, I see the Jupiter, Mars, and Saturn, as fundamentally descriptive of Pisces, of Scorpio, and of Aquarius. But it took me a long time. And the first time I went to a lecture and they were talking about it, I thought, what are they talking about? This is nonsense, coming from America in the 60s, where we didn't have any of that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that transition with the modern versus traditional rulerships has been a really stark thing back and forth, like over the past 2 decades with Western astrology.
Yeah. No, it's been nice that that's come in, all that history, and to be able to put them together, or to see, it's like seeing another dimension of something, and it's so obvious once you see it. I think of let's say the Pluto and the Neptune and the Uranus as some kind of field that those signs can tap into, a collective field in which they naturally tap into, but then they come back down into their own, I want to say personal rulership, but that's not the right word, is it? Traditional rulership. Yeah, that's the right word. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So that's Cancer and Capricorn. Other ones are like Pisces and Virgo as another combination of earth versus water signs.
Yes. They're so necessary to each other, aren't they? But then, of course, I'm very close to someone who's a Pisces with Moon in Virgo. So
I feel like Virgo is the most practical of the earth signs. I don't know if that's going too far, because obviously Capricorn would really want to compete for that position. But Virgo, and when we say practical, sometimes we're talking about like the day-to-day needs and the small necessities to keep things going in a very like tangible way.
Yes, and very like things can be fixed. I mean, it is Mercury, isn't it? It's literally day to day, and it's not like the Taurus can build a house and the Capricorn can hold the world together, or not at the moment, but in general, make it work, the structure. But the Virgo keeps it going from day to day, keeps it going. I think I remember I was in South Africa when I started doing charts for a living. And the 6th house was always about servants, always. When I came to this country, I didn't know what to do with the 6th house. I had when people had planets there, they didn't have servants, the people who came to me. So I didn't. And then I thought of the 6th house as the kitchen, the place where the food is made, where things happen, where you go and talk and you're there. And I think of it as, in London, we have this on the tube, it says mind the gap between the train and the platform sometimes. And I think of that as the 6th house. It's where you mind the gap between the imaginal being incarnated in the animal body. And if the imaginal being handles well the animal body in which they are incarnated, then they're healthy. But if there's a gap between the imaginal being out there and the animal body, then it's difficult. And then there's something called ill health, let us say. And Virgos, this is having Sun in this 6 is different, but Virgos seem to go back and forth. That's why they're so practical. The idea and how it works, We need to have that. Okay, this is how it works. I agree with you. I think it's the most down to earth, on and on practical sign of all in the zodiac. Must be nice to have planets there.
I was thinking like the maintenance person is a good example of like a Virgo type thing, which is somebody that might be like a jack of all trades, or that's good at the day-to-day details of what it takes to maintain or to fix something. And Virgo tends to be, because it's ruled by Mercury, again, more focused on like small or local things, as opposed to Pisces, ruled by, at least traditionally, by Jupiter, which tends to be more far-ranging or like big things.
Yes, and also things that like out there, that I always think of the compassion of Pisces, and it's not necessarily to the people right there with you, but it's out there. It happens to the beggars, it's the ones, it just happens somewhere. It appears, it rises and falls in some way. It comes and goes. And the Pisces, it's almost like it serves on a level that's invisible quite often, and therefore it doesn't get back the ego recognition that some of the other signs do, or in our age that is so popular, because what it does almost literally behind the scenes or invisibly somehow.
Right, like that idea of having compassion, like Pisces would be like compassion for like the poor or
That's it.
for,
Yeah.
let's say like the homeless
Yeah.
or other broader things like that, where they're motivated to almost like social causes, but
That's
through an
it.
underlying sense of compassion.
Yeah, I think so. I had I had a client in Africa that I learned something about Pisces, and I still remember it because it was so surprising or shocking. He was in his, I don't know, to me, he was quite old, but I was young, so I don't know, he could have been in his 40s. And he had come from Canada, and he'd left his wife of 20 years or something. And he told me a story about why and he had lots of planets in Pisces. And he said she had been complaining about the house, and she didn't like it and didn't like it and didn't like it. So one day he went out and he bought another house. And one day at breakfast, he said was complaining about the house, and he said, "It's okay. We're selling this house, and I bought another house." And she said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, I've sold this house, or I'm on the verge of selling this house. And I bought another house because you don't like it." And she said, "What are you talking about? I like this house." And he got up and he went upstairs and he packed his bag and he went to the airport and he left her. And he said, "I'd been doing things forever for her and she never saw it." So I remember after that, to any Pisces, I would say you have to learn to let people know you're giving to them, because often people don't know because you're giving in a way that isn't seen. And so you've got to be able to learn to express it somehow. Otherwise, you'll feel resentful and over time just disappear. And I think that's Pisces. Whereas I don't think Virgo does that. I think it also it also serves, but it's more edgy. So it's more likely to let you know if it's, it's more articulate because it's, I suppose, Mercury like that. And the two
Sure.
together are about service on all levels.
Yeah, that makes sense. But it's more clear because Virgo also has that tendency to like serve or to be helpful or to want to give things. But yeah, you're
Absolutely.
right. Sometimes it can be more clear what the transactional nature is of it,
Yeah.
whereas it's less clear sometimes with Pisces.
Yes. And you can not notice that the Pisces has been just doing this stuff. I mean, we went away with somebody, and she had Mercury and Venus in Pisces, and she was in Aries, and I had to keep watching because I noticed, because I knew those Pisces planets, and I knew that she'd be doing stuff and nobody would notice. So I paid attention to noticing somehow. And then after we had a conversation, and she said it was true that she would do things, and she did it in such a way nobody noticed, and then she'd feel awful, somehow. So I think one has to, I suppose we all have to learn to express who we are in a way that others can get it. Otherwise we get very misunderstood, hurt, isolated, all of that.
Maybe
Yeah,
part of it is that for Virgo, the currency is material, but for Pisces, the currency is more emotional in some way.
absolutely. And more, yeah, it does things that touch a part of you that you don't even know necessarily is longing or needing something. Yeah,
But then that's hard to quantify, which might be an issue for all of the water signs, is a difficulty um, quantifying that.
in a culture that thinks everybody should be fine all the time, absolutely fine. Yes, it's difficult. I think it is more difficult, perhaps, for water than any other sign in our culture, because in our culture you have to be fine, and if you've got water planets, you have all the that everything rises and falls, and it connects to things that are much earlier, and you're having to weave other collective feelings, your feelings, childhood feelings all the time. And so the need to have a self-reflective space is probably, is it more important than any other sign? But it is very important, I think. Otherwise, you can get so unseen, perhaps, is a way of saying it. I mean, the real self unseen.
Right.
So self-reflection is probably important. Yeah.
That kind of brings me to one we could touch on at this point, which is Scorpio and Taurus.
That's where I was going to in my mind. That's interesting.
Okay, because you were talking about like compassion as being one of the primary things that definitely unifies Pisces and even Cancer to a certain extent, but that's also true, but a little bit more obscure with Scorpio. And there was like a word play in my mind where compassion in Scorpio, part of that is like passion as one of the key words that is related, but maybe more connected with Scorpio in some ways.
Yes, the Mars thing, partly.
Right.
Mars and Scorpio. I have a image for Mars, I suppose Mars and Scorpio rather than Scorpio itself, because I worked with someone in Africa who had Mars and Scorpio, and it's like you don't see it at all, the Mars and Scorpio. It's totally friendly and peaceful and never gets angry and everything. And then one day something gets it, and then like a shark comes up, and you never forget it. You've been so, and then it goes down and back very calm again. And I've always thought of it that way. It's survival, but it doesn't show because perhaps, I don't know, it's water. It's so surprising to me. And the thing about the Scorpio for me is that if we look at compassion, the essence of Scorpio is that it, without meaning to or meaning to, depending on self-reflection, it knows I want to say the part in the other person that either needs to be renovated or eliminated, if I put it that way, that it hits the very survival thing in the other person. And so when it gets upset, and it doesn't know it quite often, it's not conscious, water isn't thinking, and when it gets upset or hurt, and other people often don't know that it gets upset or hurt, when they do, it comes out and you're just, and without knowing it, it's touched, it's attacked the survival thing in you, the most sensitive part of yourself. And so I think it's one of those signs that really has to get to know itself, because it doesn't know, it's water. It doesn't know what it's hitting when it does that. And once it does know, it's very healing. It's extraordinary because it can touch something that is so hidden and needs to be brought out in another person. That's why I think of detectives and psychotherapists,
Maybe it's like the water that seeps into cracks and therefore knows where the weaknesses and the imperfections lie. But then that information can be used for good or for bad, depending on whatever the other circumstances are.
Yeah. And I think it's important with planets in Scorpio to perhaps, again, to know oneself, really, because otherwise you have no idea how that's going to come out and what it's going to hit somehow. But because it can also, if it does it with, let us say, with compassion, it touches something that needs to be either transformed or eliminated in the system. And it can happen. I'm thinking of a very close friend of mine, Scorpio. He can come in this room and he'll say, that chair's in the wrong place. And he's right. It even operates on that level. There's something that doesn't work here. What is it? And over time, I've learned to hear when he does that somehow. So it has a killer edge, but it can also utterly transform. So it's one of those signs that needs to probably understand itself or its own effect on other people more than other signs. and then it has the ability to transform itself and others. And it's so opposite Taurus, isn't it?
Yeah, I was just thinking about Taurus as the opposing sign, as also a fixed sign, but an Earth sign ruled by Venus, as opposite to Scorpio, which is traditionally ruled by Mars as a water
Yeah.
sign.
Yeah.
And these two, more than some of the other signs, it kind of makes me think of this concept that's become really popular over the past few years, but it's actually not that not that recent. But it's the idea of like the 5 love languages. Are you familiar with this?
No, I'm not.
It's
What's
just
the
this idea that different people have different. It's from this book from 1982 by somebody named Gary Chapman, but it's become really trendy, it seems like, in the past few years. But they say that there's 5 ways to express and experience love that they call love languages. And these are words of affirmation is number 1, acts of service is number 2, number 3 is receiving gifts, number 4 is quality time, and number 5 is physical touch. And the idea is that different people have a tendency where they have their own personal love language, and sometimes their love language may be the same as or may differ from their partners, but that somehow by learning that you can learn what feels better to the other person and therefore create a better relationship. But some of these are like already invoking some of the keywords that we found in some of these different combinations, like the idea of like words of affirmation or acts of service, for example, on the Virgo Pisces level axis, perhaps. But then when we get to Taurus and Scorpio, I think we get into the 2 of these. One of them is like receiving gifts, and the other is physical touch, because it seems like Taurus and Scorpio, Taurus especially because it's an Earth sign, tends to be more about physical, physical things, like that which is physical and that which is tangible as an expression of love or affection.
And the thing about receiving gifts is interesting because somebody taught me once. I'd given a lecture and they came up and said nice things, and I said, "Oh, thanks." And my friend said, "No, when somebody offers you a gift like that, you listen." She said, "When somebody's because I was just learning to lecture, and she was I said, "You got to help me learn how." And she said, that's what she criticized, because she said she gave you a gift, she praised you, and you didn't accept her gift. So when somebody says something nice to you, you listen. It's a gift she's giving. And I thought that was very powerful. But I'm interested in the Scorpio of receiving gifts. Is it?
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's either because I could definitely see Taurus for receiving gifts. I could see Scorpio certainly as physical touch.
Yes.
But then there's certainly like an interplay between those two as like Mars and Venus ruled signs, and the interchange. I could see both of those as being applicable in some way.
Yes. Yeah.
So let's see what else. Taurus as an Earth sign ruled by Venus, and the physical. We've used the words like practical very much for other Earth signs like Capricorn and Virgo, and there's certainly like a practical quality to Taurus, but there's also maybe more of a material quality than any of the other signs in some sense.
In Taurus, it's really interesting. Taurus seems to me, above all things, to want peace and just comfort. Let's just be happy together. And intensity is the last thing it wants. And whether Scorpio wants it or not, it gets there through an intensity. It's alive through intense concentration, through intense interaction, and it's not necessarily comfortable, whereas Taurus is all about comfort. And Scorpio, even if it has other things in it, it is not about comfort. It's about something that hits the very fundament of something and transforms it in some way. So I always think of it as whitewater rapid, one of those waterfalls, which whitewater rapids. It can go peaceful for a period of time, but suddenly there has to be this intense interaction for it to be doing what it is natural. Whereas Taurus is exactly the opposite. Let's just have a really quiet time. And yet the two have a dynamic between them, because if you only had this kind of perfectly fine and no volcanoes, nothing would ever change. And if you only had volcanoes and storms, nothing would ever settle. So they're very fundamental to interactions, aren't they? To relationship, because you need that going farther than is comfortable for intimacy.
Right. The depth of emotion.
Absolutely. Yeah. And for Taurus, you need the steadiness, and you get used to the person, and you have habits, and you know, but to get to the Scorpio place of rebirth, you have to go through something to get there. Whereas with Taurus, you just stay there and be there. And yet they're so powerful in their, it's such different, like Aries, Libra, Mars and Venus, Taurus, Scorpio, Venus and Mars, both about relationships, really. And you to get that vulnerable, to have intimacy, you have to get very vulnerable so that you can be betrayed. You can't have intimacy unless betrayal is possible, if I'm saying it properly,
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Taurus isn't about that. It's about something that you get used to and steady, and yet they're necessary. Both are necessary for life, or for relationship to keep moving in some way, to stay alive.
Yeah, I mean, that brings up an interesting point that we haven't focused on too much, but just that both Taurus and Scorpio are fixed signs, and that's always going to be something that these oppositions share in common, is the same quadruplicity.
That's
so
true.
Aries and Libra are also Mars and Venus ruled signs, and also have that oppositional quality of elements of fire and air, but they're both cardinal signs.
Yeah.
So there might ultimately be something that the signs share in common in the way that they approach things, which might be the basis of their reconciliation or their ability to reconcile with one another.
Yes.
Just thinking of like Scorpio and Taurus both being fixed signs, for example.
Yes. So that's the thing that makes them, in spite of the fact of being so opposite, it's the thing they both get. Because when both are, like when you're in Taurus and you stay, you're not going to run around. Once you're there, you're there.
Right.
And once you're loyal as a Scorpio, you're going to be loyal. And if you're not, it's like a death, that you're so the intent. And so I think you're right. And Aries and Libra, they're so opposite, but they're both cardinal. So they understand something about the constant moving, in a way. That's interesting. And then the mutables, of course.
That makes me think, because that in Aristotle, when he introduced the qualities, that was part of the way that he introduced them, was the idea that the elements could turn into one another through the underlying qualities, and that the ones that shared some similar element could turn into each other more readily. So maybe this is the astrological equivalent of that, which is that we have these opposing elements with each of the signs, but they have the ability perhaps more easily to either transmute and turn into each other, or at least to find balance because they share that similarity in the same quadruplicity, not to mention being the same polarity or the same gender, whatever you want to call it, either masculine or feminine, or positive or negative or what have you.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because if you take, say, when a Taurus gets angry, it's Scorpio. They don't do it often in general. If there are lots of planets in Taurus, they don't have it's not their energy. That's not what they're going to do. But when it happens, everything changes.
It stays that way.
It stays that way. And when a Scorpio decides to stay, they stay no matter what.
Right.
All the way. So there is a kind
which can be like with Taurus, like I think about, like, one of my favorite examples of like fixed sign heavy placements is like George Martin, the author of the fantasy books that became popular recently, which I'm drawing a blank on their name, Game of Thrones and those whole books. Anyways, he has a Taurus rising, and his ruler of the ascendant is Venus, which is in Leo, and he has such a dominance of fixed sign placements that he has been writing. He's a writer, but he has been writing on the same computer that he got way back in like 1992 or something like that, and he doesn't want to change because that system works for him. So
Absolutely.
he just keeps writing on the same computer for 3 decades, even though it's probably less easy or less safe in terms of backing things up. He found something that works for him, so he sticks with it.
Yeah.
And that's like a good example of like Taurus, and
Absolutely.
once you
Yeah.
find something, you sort of stick with it where you're
Yeah.
comfortable. With Scorpio, you have like a similar thing in terms of fixity, but it makes me think of like emotionally sticking with something, or an emotion that sticks with you and stays and is permanent.
Yes.
And that can sometimes be even a negative emotion, like holding a grudge or something like that,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
crossing somebody who then holds a grudge for like 30 years.
Yes.
Um,
Exhausting.
right,
Yes.
which would be a fixed sign thing, but it's more of a water thing where it's something that sticks with you that's more emotional in nature.
Yes, it's interesting when you're talking about the fixity. Really is fixed, isn't it? If you, I mean, it's and especially, I mean, it is in Leo and Aquarius, but it's so obvious in Taurus and Scorpio. You know,
Yeah, it has a more tangible quality in some ways.
yeah, yeah. It's almost like the first four are the elemental of, and then each set after are variations on the theme of the first Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, and then Leo, Virgo, Libra, and they're variations almost on the theme of the primary ones of the first four.
Yeah, I mean that's something I keep going back to as well, and I think that's really clear in modern astrology, in the way that modern astrologers articulate the elements, that they're often all based on the first four signs, especially.
Mm,
And I've been trying to understand if that's, yeah, if that's really the primary way to approach it,
mm,
conceptually, or how that works out exactly. Like Cancer, for example, often being the way that astrologers almost archetypally approach all of the water signs. Is that what you're saying?
yes, yes, yes. Almost, it's almost like I don't know.
It's like the
It's
paradigm.
the simplest way to describe water.
Hmm.
Fire is Aries. The simplest way to describe Earth is Taurus. Like that. And then you do them again, and you articulate them in a new way, and then a new way, and then the most sophisticated way of all. You might say the most complex way of all when you get to um, Capricorn, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces. Then it's almost like more than fire, earth, air, and water. I mean, it's still fire, earth, air, and water, but it's not as primary as Aries is. Each one is more developed, or I want to, when I get to the last ones, I want to say sophisticated in a way, because they're about out there. Yeah.
Maybe it has to do with the fact that the first four have to deal with like personal planets, like inner planets, like Mars,
Mm,
then in
Venus.
Aries, then Venus in Taurus, then
Yeah.
Mercury in Gemini, and then the Moon in Cancer. Obviously, you still then you go through another set of personal planets with the next set, which is the Sun in
Sun,
Leo, Mercury in Virgo, Venus in
Venus again,
Libra,
and then Mars.
and then Mars in Scorpio. But then after that, you start
That's
getting
it.
just all outer
Yeah.
planets,
Yeah. Maybe. Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah. There was
Um,
something else. Oh, it came and went. Another one of those sentences. Anyway, maybe it'll come back. I don't know.
are there any pairs that we completely skipped over? Like I'm trying to think.
Aries,
So
Taurus, Gemini, Sag, Cancer, Leo,
So we did
Virgo.
Taurus, Scorpio, Gemini, Sag, Cancer, Capricorn, definitely.
Yeah,
Did we start with Leo and Aquarius?
I think we did. Yeah,
Okay. Did we
yeah,
do Aries and Libra?
yeah,
Little bit, yeah.
yeah. Oh yes, I wanted to say something about Aries though. When I was doing fire, originally, I remember having difficulty with Aries because I thought of fire as images, and I said to my Aries, "Do you live by image?" My Aries friends didn't, but the image and the action are one with Aries, so they
Mm.
don't have an image that then leads them to something. They and the image come together. It's so Martian, like they move with it, and it's almost not even there necessarily. They don't even operate from images, whereas I think the Leos and Sagittarius they do. They have idea. Well, let's say Sagittarius, images is not quite the right word. A sense of something, meaning, but in Aries, I thought because I kept seeing it as image, and I thought they move from something. And I called it sperm energy because
Mm.
it was the first sign, and it was pure Mars, just go, and go and go, and when you get to the creation, something dies, you disappear, and then the creation happens, and then once that happens, you have to go again. And I always thought, in those years where I was operating in terms of reincarnation, if I have another incarnation here, I want to be an Aries, because I've known Aries in their 90s, and they still have that absolute energy of, yes, go, somehow.
Mm.
And it's pure life just coming in, and it's so alive. And then opposite is, okay, now we learn the dance. Now we learn how to move. Now we and everyone is like that. That to have a relationship of any kind, you have to know how to be this self and to honor the other, and to
Mm.
be this self and to honor the other, back and forth. So
Right. So Libra is the um, not just oppositional quality, but the contrast of not just what pushing forward on oneself. I'm trying to think of how to articulate that, and what Libra as an air sign brings to Mars, or how it opposes it in some way.
it's interesting. I've gone off slightly in it because I suddenly had an image, and I remember thinking that Libra has. Is it? Am I seeing it clearly? Let me just see. Yeah, I was thinking of it as Moon in Libra. That's right. I always have. I learned it from somebody who was in his 80s. He was fabulous, and I watched him, and I noticed that I said, frogs have two sets of eyelids, and one is the ordinary kind, and another is an invisible. They come over when they're underwater.
Mm.
And I thought, oh, that's Moon in Libra, and maybe it's Libra in general, because when things get too intense on the outside, this other set of eyelids comes across, and something in them sort of goes quiet and disappears a bit. And then when things settle down, they come out again. And whereas Aries is out there, just, it's alive when it can come out there. And Libra Libra energy is alive when the dance is happening. It's not me, it's not you, it's the dance itself somehow. But I always think of that with my friend, that he got this other set of eyelids when anything got too intense and when conflict was around, and then he'd disappear for a while and then come back when it became quiet again, when it became harmonious again, when it became appropriate, when things were appropriate again. Yeah.
One of the things that's interesting about Libra, though, is even though it's a Venus ruled sign, it can sometimes be in acting as a counterbalance against Mars. It can push back just as hard, and it can be
Yes.
just as oppositional, or sometimes like contrarian. Is an interesting tendency with Libra. Like for some reason, I sometimes run into, I feel like, a lot of skeptics who have heavy Libra placements
Oh,
that
that's interesting.
will push back on an idea, and that in and of itself becomes what defines them in some way. And I often wonder if it's through the Libra and the air placement sort of like cooling off the fire placement represented by the almost like singularity of Aries.
Oh, that's interesting. I must look. I must look and see that. I always think of Libra as in love with the good, the true, and the beautiful according to their own standards.
Mm.
And so if you're expressing something that isn't according to their idea of the good, the true, and the beautiful, Venus has a temper too. She's not only a kind of gentle little creature. She knows what she wants and she knows what she likes. Do you remember when she says to Helen, when Helen doesn't want to go back to Paris at some point, and she said, but it's war and I'm causing so much trouble. And she says, I have loved you above all, and you have the beauty because of that. Do not deny me, or don't do what I say, and you will find out what it's like to have my hate. And that was in the Iliad, and I was shocked by that when I read it. And I thought, it's true that Venus, and in both Venus signs, they're both opposed by Mars in both cases. So there is something of the opposite that can come in when in the Libra case, the good, the true, and the beautiful is being betrayed, when the ideal of how things work, let's say, is being betrayed. And I suppose with the when somebody, from the Taurus point of view, when someone's trying to take away the comfort and safety, it comes up very, very powerfully in both of those. That's interesting. Yeah.
Right. I'm trying to think if there's anything. Obviously, we also have like the social component, which is what a component of all of the air signs. Libra is where it comes out even more as like a plurality or two rather than just one, as the first opposition between those two, which we already saw with Leo versus Aquarius, but we get a similar dynamic with Aries and Libra, but in more of a just you versus me type situation, especially or you versus I in relationships.
Yes, and Leo is more me versus us, I think.
Right.
Yeah, me versus the family, the group of somehow, rather than me versus you. Yeah, and it's interesting that that both the Mars and Venus ones are the first two, and then that's it. They've done that,
Right, and they're done.
Yeah, and then they're done. Whereas the mutables are everywhere, across the.
Maybe that takes us back to, and maybe that's part of the paradigm, going back to Empedocles and the idea of these four elements and them being brought together and pushed apart through these principles of love and strife.
Yeah.
Because that's exactly what Venus and Mars are. We have Venus, which is the idea of love and unity and bringing things together, and Mars, which is strife.
Absolutely.
And separating things or pulling things apart.
Yes.
So maybe those four signs then, as being the starting point, set up the paradigm for the rest of the elements.
That's interesting. And also in any relationship, if you get to a point where there's no strife, you lose something. There has to be the otherness. It's almost like you have to know where you don't, to keep it alive in some way. And so couples who end up just being little aardvark and munchkin, and they go along and they turn into mush in some way. Whereas when they stay edgy at some level, it's almost like life still carries on in some way. So there's almost a need for them to be opposite on so many different levels, Mars and Venus. And I suppose Jupiter and Mercury the same. That the facts and the information have to turn into meaning. Otherwise, they're endless and boring and nothing happens. But if it's all about meaning, there's no communication anymore. There's no interaction. So they really do include each other, don't they? Somehow.
Right.
And you can't have the Leo hearth center unless there are people around it. Otherwise, the Leo can't be the Leo.
Right. Or what's the point of building everything, or building the house in or a skyscraper or something with Capricorn if you don't have people in there to live in it and to create a home?
Absolutely. Exactly the same. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
All right. I like that. Perfect. Well, I think
we should probably stop at 7:30.
Yeah. I think we're getting towards the end of this. So thanks a lot for joining me for this today. This is a very fun, like free-flowing conversation, and we didn't really plan this like a lot. We both prepared a bit, but this went really well. You've actually done, in addition to your two books on this, I wanted to mention, recently did a series of webinars for MISPA, the Mercury Internet School of Astrology, where you did a full webinar lecture on each of the elements, right?
Yes, I did. Yeah, I enjoyed it hugely. And I don't think, I started looking at my books again when you started talking about this, but I think when I did my Fire, Earth, Air, and Water with MISPA, I don't even think I looked at the books at that. I just went into the new version of what I was seeing somehow. And it's so satisfying again and again to go back to the same things that you haven't in a while, because you've gotten more experience and you're seeing it in a new way, and the planets have moved. So you're seeing things in a different way as well. But I really enjoyed doing those element webinars for John at MISPA. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, I'll put links to the books on the description page for this episode on the astrologypodcast.com website and
Okay.
also below the YouTube video. And I'll also put links to where people can check out those webinars that you did on each of the
Okay.
elements.
Thank you.
And you have a website, which is just darbycostello.co.uk,
Yeah.
which I'll
.co.uk. Yeah.
.co, and I'll
Yeah.
also link to that. Do you have
Thank you.
anything coming up, or what are you working on now over the next year?
Oh, yeah. One thing after I'm doing things for MISPA and for Astrology University, little bits of things as I go along. And
Okay.
am I traveling? I've been traveling so much, but I think, oh yes, I'm going to that one in America. Are you going to that one in America?
The ESAR conference, in
Yeah,
Denver.
that's the next big thing, I think. And I'm going to Germany in early July and giving a weekend there. I often do in Hamburg every few years, and I'll be in Berlin as well, working a bit. And otherwise, and the faculty, of course. I'll be at the summer school at the faculty teaching.
Okay. This summer?
And yeah, this summer. And things, I don't know, I'd have to think. They're probably on my website. If I can't remember what they are, they're probably on my website. Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'll link people to that, but they can do just a Google search for you, just darbycostello.co.uk, and they'll find your
Yeah.
website with links to all of your classes and
Various
webinars and upcoming
things.
schedule and everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank
Awesome.
you.
Well, thanks a lot for joining me today for this. I really appreciate it.
It was a real pleasure. I really enjoyed it. We did travel, didn't we? We various places, in
Yeah,
spite
I
of the
think,
fact that there are 5 planets in Earth, and is it 3 in water today? Yeah, we
yeah,
managed to get fire and air going as well.
yeah, we got a moon in Gemini, which helped out. And
Yes,
yeah, this was good. So thanks for
it
joining me today.
was a pleasure.
And thanks everyone for listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast. And we'll see you again next time.
Okay.
Thanks to the patrons who helped to support the production of this episode of the Astrology Podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to patrons Christine Stone, Nate Craddock, and Marin Altman, as well as the AstroGold Astrology app available at astrogold.io, the Portland School of Astrology at portlandastrology.org, and the Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs available at honeycomb.co. The production of this episode of the podcast is also supported by the International Society for Astrological Research, which is hosting a major astrology conference in Denver, Colorado, September 10th through the 14th, 2020. More information about that at isar2020.org. And finally, also SolarFire Astrology software, which is available at alabe.com, and you can use the promo code AP15 for a 15% discount on that software. For more information about how to become a patron of the Astrology Podcast and help support the production of future episodes while getting access to subscriber benefits like early access to new episodes or other bonus content, go to patreon.com/astrologypodcast.